Okay, so what I was about to say was, for those of you who don't know, there are three ways to cut a taper on a lathe. Well, at least there's three ways that I know of. Okay, so the first way to cut a taper on the lathe is by using your compound rest. And what you do is you swing your compound rest around and you advance the cutter only using the compound rest. And well, basically what ends up happening is you're able to cut a taper that way. Now, the obvious problem with that is you're limited as to the length of the taper. You can cut a pretty steep taper, depending on how far you want to swing this around. So like if I swing this all the way around back this way, I could cut a pretty steep taper on the end of this piece here, say for instance. But again, you're limited by the basically the travel of the compound. You're kind of confined to how much you can get, how far you can actually get that thing to go. And if you want to cut like a longer taper, it's pretty much almost impossible. If you rotate the compound almost perpendicular and you just want to do a very shallow taper, then you'll get a little bit more length. But again, you're going to be pretty limited to how much you can do, and you can also run into some clearance issues. So that's one way to cut a taper. The second way you can cut a taper on a lathe is by offsetting the tailstock. Most metal cutting lathes, there is a facility of some way, there is some way to offset the tailstock in either this direction or this direction. And in this particular tailstock, it's no exception. This top piece right here actually slides on this base piece in a mortise, almost like a mortise and tenon type of arrangement here. And you've got a screw here and a screw here. So you would loosen one screw and tighten the other screw, or vice versa, to shift the tailstock back and forth. And effectively, if that allows you to cut a taper on a piece that you're turning between centers. So if the piece is rotating between the centers and this center is offset, excuse me, then when the cutter is down this end, the cutter is actually, if the tailstock, say in this particular instance, let's say the tailstock was offset towards me. Well, if it's offset towards me, then that means when the cutter is down this end, if I'm not changing the position of the cutter in or out, and I'm making a cut here, I'm actually taking more of a cut down this end, and as it gets down that end, it's going to be taking less of a cut. So you'll end up with moving the tailstock this way gives you thinner on this end, getting thicker that way, so you get a taper in that direction. If I offset the tailstock away from me, that direction, what ends up happening is now the cutter is essentially further away or taking less of a cut here, and will take more of a cut as it gets towards the headstock. So you'll end up with thicker going to thinner. So that's if you got a long piece you want to cut a taper on, you can do it by offsetting the tailstock and turning it between centers. The problem with that is you can't take a really steep taper with that, because you've only got so much that you can offset this before either A, it's physically just not going to be able to be done because of your limitations of your lathe's design, or the fact that you just don't want to be, don't forget, if we're turning between centers, we've got a live or dead center that's actually engaged in a center hole that was drilled in the end of the piece of stock, and you want that seated well in there. Well, as that piece is pushed away out this way or this way, once you get a little bit too far out, now your center is actually going in at an angle. Of course, the center is still coming out straight, but your piece effectively starts to be engaging that center point at an angle. So that could be problematic. The third way to turn a taper on a lathe that I know of is with a tapering attachment. And the tapering attachment is basically a complete assembly that bolts onto the back of the lathe as an accessory And some lathes, like this one here, just didn't come with them. And I don't know whether or not this lathe had the ability to have one added at some point later. I don't see any drilled and tapped bolt holes on the back of the lathe, so I'm guessing that maybe this lathe never was made to have one. So that brings me back to what I started to talk about. This issue that I've had with this lathe ever since I've had it from day one. And what I noticed is that when this lathe, the tailstock, when you unlock it to slide it back and forth, you can actually rock it. I could twist it. I mean, you can hear it, but I bet you if I zoom in, I bet you can even see it pretty clearly. See that little bit of movement? Well, that's a problem. That shouldn't be there. Now, a while back, I had mentioned, I think that, and one of the guys who's must be an avid Atlas lathe owner or knows a lot about Atlas lathes. I think he might even be one of the individuals who's on the Atlas Yahoo group. He had said that on his lathe, I believe he had said that there was actually a jib screw adjustment, that there was a jibs that you could adjust to basically tighten that. The problem is, I don't know if that came out on later lathes, but on this lathe, it doesn't exist. This lathe does not have any kind of a jib or anything. This basically is part of this lower casting, this edge that I'm touching here, and the same thing over here. So what I believe has happened is, I believe just from years of this sliding back and forth on the bed, I think that it's actually loosened up, that it's worn. Now, the workaround that I found with this, fortunately, I found that if I think if I twist it in one direction, it's off center, and if I twisted it in the other direction, it was on center. So what I've been doing is I've just been making sure I've been holding it twisted in the proper direction before I tighten it. And I could just tell I could just let the next prospective owner, in on that little trick, and be done with it, because I don't foresee any other way that I'm gonna be able to rectify this problem without doing something pretty drastic. I mean, potential fixes would be to actually build up those surfaces with weld, and then set this up in the mill in some way so I could come back and actually mill those areas smooth back down to the exact dimension that fits in the well. But I mean, that doesn't seem realistic to me. I'm not saying it wouldn't work. I'm just saying that if something were to go wrong, I could really end up making a mess out of this thing. So I'm not really comfortable with that. Alright, so here's an angle that really shows the problem with this error. So if I put a little bit of a twist on this tailstock as I bring this in, you can see that it looks like the center point's hitting right dead center on that end, and that's assuming that I think I did face this piece in this lathe. So watch what happens if I twist it the other way. I'll just twist it fast so you can actually really see the exaggerated movement. So now if I twist it over this way, bring it back in, it's off just a little bit. If I really, really wanted to find out just how much of an issue that is, I could take the chuck off, put a dead center in the chuck, in the spindle hole, and then run this live center right up to it and see how the 2 points touch. I'm actually thinking I want to take this chuck off. I've never taken this chuck off This chuck has been on the machine since I got it, and I don't know what's in there for a spindle, but I found this dog drive plate actually hanging out with this lathe when I was cleaning out that estate. Now, it doesn't fit the Hendy. It's too small for the Hendy spindle. And, you know, there was a South Bend lathe there, I think, that went to somebody in the family. So it's possible that that was, you know, that's a South Bend one. I don't know. I'd like to include this this dog plate with the lathe, if it does fit it, as an extra accessory, just to sweeten the deal to anybody who might be looking at purchasing this lathe. So let's see if we can't get that chuck off of there. This ought to be interesting. Well, let's see. Let's try this pipe wrench on this piece of stock that I have in the chuck. Of course, there's any number of reasons why this might not work. Pipe wrench could slip. The stock could slip in the chuck. Or the belts could slip on the drive. There's no way to lock the spindle on this thing. Man, that's tight. Let's see. The other thing I could do is see if we get a block of wood. No, this is a hunk of solid PVC, but it'll do the same. Okay. So it'll have the same effect, which is that when this comes around, we'll protect the bed. There we go. So now let's see if we can put two hands on this wheel and give it some force.
Oh my goodness, that's tight.
I don't know why. You know, I don't know whether or not there is some way that this chuck could be locked from unscrewing. You know, sort of like when I went to take the Hendy apart to move it way back when, I remember I couldn't get the chuck off. And then I ended up finding that there was a set screw that I had to loosen to allow it to unscrew. And I don't know if that's something somebody added or if that was actually by design. But what I see on the back of this is an aluminum collar. In other words, there's this collar right here. I have no idea what the deal is with this. But that certainly doesn't look like it's part of this backing plate. There are, or I should say there is, a hole in the back of that collar. Actually, there's another one there. Now, if I had to, if I had to venture a guess, I'd say that the holes in that collar are there for a wrench to grab onto. All right. Well, I also recall that here on the spindle, there are plenty of jaw marks from somebody putting a pipe wrench on that right there. So I've got a feeling that that's how somebody was handling taking this this chuck off. All right, yeah, I know, it wasn't pretty, but I I put this pipe wrench on here where somebody's been doing it for years by the looks of it, and used that, and then to keep the chuck from moving, what I did was I've got the jaws extended pretty far because I've got this chuck holding this pretty substantial piece right here. So I put this big steel plate across the ways. And on top of the plate, I put my solid PVC piece at an angle so that the jaw would just catch on it, and that was enough to break it free. Let's see if it's loose enough to unscrew now. There we go. I could see already that spindle's a lot smaller than I thought it would be. So that spindle right there is too small even for that dog plate that I found, I think. Pretty sure. Yeah, not even close. Alright, so the mystery continues as to what that fits. It's 1.5 inches. Let's see what the threads per inch is. Well, I could do a 1/2 inch and double it, but I bet you it's not going to be an even number. It might be 8. Might be 8 TPI. You know what? I've got I just had my thread gauge in my pocket because I was working on the mercury outboard earlier today. Alright, so this should be 8 TPI right here, and that's a perfect match. So 1.5 inch, 8 TPI. One of the biggest other issues with this lathe is that I only have this 3-jaw chuck that has these auxiliary jaws that had been welded onto it by somebody, and it just makes it really look like a hack job.